Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Historians Lounge episode. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today's guest comes courtesy of my Wandering Scribe podcast series many years ago. For those who may remember my guest, magazine. Oh, apologies. Everything all good?
It's actually cutting out right now.
Oh no. Apologies, listeners, a bad connection, but don't worry, you won't see us in the final cut. But as I was saying, she's a talented historian, a wonderful author, and speaking of which, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing her upcoming book with pen and swords called African Women of the Ancient World, Queens, Consorts, and Warriors. So let's give a huge warm welcome to a first timer on the YouTube channel, historian Katie Clark. Katie, thank you so much for coming back again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Nice. Now, before we dive into your book, is there anything else you'd like to add about your bio? Any other things you've worked on that you'd like people to know about recently?
So I did finish up a year-long series with the Historians magazine, and that actually having that connection is what led to this current book. So that's actually been really exciting, something that I didn't expect to happen when it did, but I'm very, very grateful.
Awesome. Awesome. So let's dive right into the episode. So, first things first, what can you tell us about your upcoming book with pen and sword?
Okay. So the book, as you said, is African Women, Queens of the Ancient World, Queens, Consorts, and Warriors. So it's a collection of 9 different women that I have selected from different time periods throughout ancient African history and through from different countries across Africa, and really diving into those cultures, what they kind of looked like in ancient times, and the accomplishments, but also the very flawed humanity that existed with each of these women and their contributions to not just African history, but how it ties into world history.
Fascinating. And to give us like a little preview, I don't know if you can, I don't know if pen and sword has made you sound something you can't say too much, but is there a particular woman in your lineup that you were really fascinated to dive into?
So they all had their own flair, and these women were absolute bosses, to be honest with you. I probably would have been terrified of a few of them, but there definitely is one that stands out, and that was Njinga of Angola. And
Ah, okay.
she she was very brutal, if you want to call it that, but she did come from a background where she was mistreated as a woman by her own brother, and she actually was sterilized so that there
Ooh.
would be no, yes, there would be no competing heir to the throne against him. So she kind of rose above those awful circumstances, and she ended up reclaiming that throne, if you want to say. And she was a very fierce warrior. She was very skilled in the sword. She had a lot of respect that, from the surrounding militaries. Her reputation really preceded her. So she was definitely fascinating, but there was also a lot of content that went into that chapter that might be a little bit difficult for the readers to dive into. It was uncomfortable for me just because of, my own sense of humanity and moral purpose.
Right.
But part of that chapter is the African slave trade
Mm-hmm.
across the Atlantic. So um, that is definitely a sensitive topic, but it's very important that we remember and put it into context.
Definitely. And I like that you're writing a book on this because I definitely think out of all of the places that have had scholarship written about, I definitely feel, in my opinion, that the continent of Africa kind of gets overlooked, or rather, let me say this, that certain aspects from the continent of Africa tend to get talked about more. And I definitely feel that this book is a good stepping stone in the right direction to learn about the other countries on the continent of Africa and just to learn more. And I would imagine, Katie, that you probably had like no like previous knowledge of these women when you were researching them.
There was some that I had heard of before. For example, I have heard of Nefertiti, who was married to the heretic king Akhenaten. I had heard of her, and not all of it was known to me. I'd also heard of Hatshepsut, but a lot of those histories really, like you said, weren't as well known to me. I did not know who Njenga of Angola was. I did not know who Ranavalona the First was, and she's actually known as Ranavalona, the Mad Queen of Madagascar. So she's definitely an interesting topic as well. So definitely was a very eye-opening experience with research.
Definitely. And I actually did research prior, and I don't know if you have this figure in your book, but I really hope so. And that is, of course, the Nubian queen who faced off against the Romans. She was a very powerful woman queen of the kingdom of Nubia, which is now modern day Sudan. I don't know if she's in your book, but I definitely think oh, she is?
You are talking about Amani Reynas.
Yes.
The Cycloptic queen.
Yes, yes. Oh, she's probably one of my favorite warrior queens from the African continent.
She is fascinating, and you are correct. So she didn't decapitate Caesar himself. What she did after one of her victories was she decapitated his statue. And she brought it back with her to Nubia, or what is also called Kush, and she buried it under the steps of their temple so that she and her people would have the opportunity to walk on him every day.
Man,
that's a very bold move.
that is a very bold move. Now, I would imagine when doing the research and trying to figure out the story, because this book, I imagine, has like an overall story to it with all these 9 women. What was sort of like the process in like selecting who you wanted to talk about? Because as in a story, there are so many fascinating characters in history that it's kind of hard just to pick and choose what small group of people we really want to explore. So what was it like for you, Kate, trying to really narrow in on the women you want to talk about and their overarching story in this book?
So there was a very drawn out process. So when we first started talking, me and my editor at Pen and Sword, we had discussed more of a broader range of African women to also include some African American women. Well, as conversations progressed, we had decided that it was too broad of a selection, and we wanted to narrow it down. So we chose more of an ancient African setting because, unfortunately, as time goes on, sometimes ancient history is a little bit put on the sidelines, and it's still very relevant. So we had decided to go that route. And so the process from there, it's very important to make sure that the subjects that you are including in your book have enough of the resources available to actually write something about them that isn't going to be repetitive.
Right.
So, and having enough of those resources where scholars have been able to even, debate some, or if there is a good collection of information that line up the same way. That's also very important. So that's kind of how that progressed to those 9. They had enough of the information available to them to make a full chapter for them. Because if I had decided if I was going to write about a woman in history, I wanted to do her justice.
Right.
Have enough of that information to teach somebody something that might be interested in this.
Definitely. And would you also say that you also want to find someone who not only had a lot of scholarship written about this person, but also try to maybe debunk some of the myths surrounding this person, because I definitely feel like all historical characters, at least certain ones, some of them are written by people who didn't like them. Sometimes history is written by, well, all history is written by the victors. And if you are someone in power who was in an area that did not like you, your enemies are going to write horrible things about you. So was that also an important thing for you, that you want to give these women their autonomy, their voice?
In a matter of speaking, yes. So one of the examples of that would be Ranavalona I, who is the Mad Queen of Madagascar. She is also named Ranavalona the Cruel. Now, I won't say that those names are not inaccurate. There are things that are recorded as historical facts that would be considered cruel,
Right.
just depending, obviously, especially in our Western culture, we would think a lot of things were cruel. But something that I felt was important to note about her is that she was also heavily resisting European colonization in Madagascar, and that was very important to her. She wanted to preserve their culture. She wanted to preserve their economy, their religious foundation. Right. So by resisting that, she did go into some pretty forceful tactics to achieve that. I can't say that I would condemn or condone either way, but some might say that it was definitely cruel. But at the same time, if you were to go to Madagascar, they may not have that same feeling. They may say, no, she actually was an integral part in preserving our culture.
Right. And that's really, really fascinating. One thing I love about history is the differing and sometimes conflicting perspectives of historical figures. To a degree, there are a lot of historical figures that all historians can argue who were either benevolent or malevolent. And then you have the characters who are very complex that don't really teeter to either side. They are benevolent when they have to be, and they're malevolent when they need to be. And that, I think, is very, very fascinating. So when you were creating this book and sort of like organizing it, did you want to organize it in a way where it was like linear and like when each of these women existed, or was it more so like sections, like a certain theme that some of these women may have had in common?
I chose to go in a chronological order, starting with the most ancient. So that would point to Neithotep in the Old Dynasty in Egypt. And I went from there to Hatshepsut, who was in the 18th dynasty, as well as Nefertiti, and then progressed more into Makeda of Sheba, she is probably the most elusive of the queens in my book. There's a lot of lore about her, so she was a little bit more difficult to sift through, but then it just kind of went forward in that chronological order.
Fascinating. Now, also in your title, not only it has like queens and war, but also consorts. Now, I don't think that's a term that a lot of people know that term unless you're a historian. So maybe just a little brief, little tangent. What is a consort, Kate, from your research?
Okay, so there is a difference between a queen and a consort. So, for example, with Neithotep, she was married to King Narmer, who united the upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt. When he passed away, unfortunately, of a violent hippopotamus attack, and so she had to rule in his stead. Their son, who was Or-Aha, he was not old enough to rule the kingdom by himself. He was still considered an adolescent or a child. So she would have to rule in his stead. And one of her responsibilities was to raise him to be what Egypt would need. And that would involve basic education, but also military training. Because Egypt was full of riches. So invaders were going to come, and they did. And you would need a very strong king that had a military mind.
Right.
So that would be the difference. And with a queen, they are naturally born into that royalty.
Fascinating. And I guess this sort of talks about almost like what you mentioned before, also in the bio, being fascinated with women's history. Why do you think there hasn't been a lot of scholarship on these women or any other powerful female figure in the history in their respective countries in like any form of media? Why do you think that is, in your opinion?
Well, I think with these women, they're pretty ancient. And like I said, the farther we get away from those time periods, the harder I think it is to remember them.
Right.
And the longer time goes by, they become more elusive. And I don't
Definitely.
think that I don't think it's intentional. I just think that that's the way it happens over time.
Hmm.
And that's why I felt that this was so important, was to unearth these stories that are really important and also very fascinating.
Definitely. And that's a beautiful thing again about history. You always learn something new. You always learn everything. And especially when it comes to women's history, I think that's often a field overlooked, especially if you go back to the classical age. There's a lot of powerful female rulers who you only reference or only are referenced in the chronicles of like their enemies, like the Romans, either the Byzantines, the Franks, and so forth, like Zenobia. I only learned about Zenobia like a few months ago, but she was a very powerful queen of Palermo who bowed against the Romans who wanted to establish her own autonomy. And seeing the world through her eyes is just incredible. And then tying into your book, what was sort of like the most fascinating thing researching them in their respective kingdoms? And I ask this because whenever we have scholars or classical scholars who reference these places that are not named for that reason, they often provide their own biases. So, in your research uncovering the truth about these women and their home, what was sort of like the striking thing that you found very fascinating?
That would definitely be Nefertiti during the 18th dynasty in Egypt. And as everyone mostly knows anything about Nefertiti, is that she was married to Akhenaten, who is deemed the heretic king. But besides that, something that people may not realize is that during their dynasty and during their rule, they introduced something called Amarna art, which was a new depiction of art on the walls of their tombs and temples. It was something that was very unique to their rule, and it showed the closeness of family that was void in previous depictions of royal families. They had their
Right.
children sitting in their laps, they were close together. There are some walls that show Nefertiti on walls painted without Akhenaten, which showed a lot of autonomy as
Ooh.
well. Yes, so that was actually a very big deal. So that is something I think the readers will find fascinating that they may not have known before. And actually, I had heard of Amarna art, but I wasn't certain of the origin until I was researching her.
I didn't either, and that is really, really fascinating. I've always been intrigued by Egyptian history, but to be honest, my knowledge of Egyptian history only goes up to Ramesses the Great being the warrior king who battled the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh and the kings that came after him. But definitely Nefertiti and the Heretic King, their dynasty and their rule is really, really fascinating. So, just a little tangent of viewers and listeners, for those who don't know the story behind them and what makes them so, depending on who you ask, infamous in Egyptian history, is the fact that they did away with the traditional gods of Egyptian culture, which is Ra, Set, Horus, Hathor, Isis, Osiris. And what they wanted their people to follow was the golden disc, which was a singular deity. And a lot of Egyptians, the high priests, were not fond of this. They were polytheistic, if I'm using the right word correctly, that
Yes.
they uh, followed multiple gods. They were not accustomed to following just one. And the story behind that is interesting. And they greatly changed Egyptian history, depending on who you ask, for better or for worse. But that's just so many fascinating facts that I think often get overlooked. And still on the lines of contributions to history, what other contributions did you find from your other women that you researched that we in the modern world really don't?
I think what some people may not realize, and it really does affect Western culture in particular, considering there's a large population of Christians here in the United States, is that one of my queens can actually be found in the Christian Bible. That is Makeda of Sheba. And it is said that she made the long trek to Jerusalem to see King Solomon.
Wow.
So that's actually something that I hadn't considered before until I was reading primary sources, Ethiopian sources. So it was very interesting deciphering through those. But that might be something that people don't quite realize here.
Right. And kind of online of sources, which I definitely think is important because all these women are from like the classical age. And when you go into the ancient sources, either first account, third account, or hearsay, the validity of these sources tends to dwindle. So for you, Katie, as a historian, how did you balance sort of like what you knew was most likely true and what was most likely probably legend or folklore that was created after the person's reign or their demise?
So part of my process is going through several sources to see if they point to the same thing, if they're going in the same direction. If you have multiple sources that are just going in all different directions, it's really hard to rely on the credibility of those sources.
Right.
So those tend to not be used, at least not by me. So I was looking for sources that were pointing in the same direction, that came up with the same conclusion, because then I can point to a little bit more credibility on their part. And I will say that during this research, I did come up with a historian's video, and I was really excited about the things that she was saying. I'm not going to mention her name,
Okay.
but unfortunately, she went from giving an academic instruction of what was going on, especially in the ancient Roman Empire as an example, and then it went into her subjective opinions on religion and religion. And to me, history needs to be as objective as possible. We all have a moral compass, but
Right.
we need to make sure that we are sticking and saying things that are consistent with the truth. So if I feel like a source is veering away from that and it's going more into an opinion, then I discard it. And I do mention several times with some of the queens that this might be more of the lore, or this has been decided to be lore, but it is something that is prevalent in that society with this queen.
Definitely. I'm actually glad you brought that up, Katie, because it is a very important topic to discuss, especially classical history. And I 100% agree. When we look at the classical world, we cannot put our own modern understandings of our society onto them, because the concepts that we have in the modern world, they don't necessarily apply or correlate to it. And that can twist the history to it. And unfortunately, make a history for that individual to suit their own story. And that does a disservice to not only the author telling the story, but also to the historical characters interwoven into the narrative. So I guess making this into a question, would you say, Katie, that this book, when it comes out, is going to be your best attempt to tell the stories of these women and just say flat out, this is the best source I can, these are the best sources I can get for these women? I am open to criticism and critique, because feel free to do so. And like, if there's something that I've missed, please let me know so I can better understand or to further educate myself on this topic or for this individual.
Yes. So this was a 14-month long process. This is not something that was just thrown together. This was over a year of research and writing and fact checking.
Right.
and everything. It's very important to me, and I think that historians should know that when they put their work out there, they're already volunteering for critique.
Mm-hmm.
And historians will debate things until the end of the ages. There's nothing that I think every historian will agree on completely, but I think that it's important for us to keep an open mind and be willing to accept that critique and also accept that knowledge, because as we continue to study things, some of those histories change.
Right. Definitely. 100%. 100%. So I'm really, really excited to read this when it comes out, because I really want to add it to my own library, especially on the chapter of the Nubian Queen, because I'm doing research for her for a book of mine, because her story is just so fascinating. And I can't wait to read the other one, especially the Queen of Madagascar and stuff like that. And actually, I want to take the opportunity to say, so in a broad sense, can you tell us what are the countries that are going to be listed, or like the previous kingdoms that are going to be mentioned in your book?
Yes. So we have ancient Egypt. That includes the Old Dynasty and the 18th Dynasty. We have Nubia, or also called Kush, Ethiopia, Angola, Nigeria, Algeria, and Madagascar.
Awesome.
This makes like a whole circle.
Definitely, you think about it, it kind of touches all like the four corners of the continent of Africa. And speaking of, you said that Algeria was another place.
Correct.
That you're going to be mentioning. Who is a figure in that book? Because to at least I'm going to be from to my knowledge, like I can't think of any powerful women from the classical age in Algeria, but I'm open to be educated on that.
That would be Dea al-Kahina.
Dea al-Kahina.
She is also known as the Jewish sorceress.
Ooh, okay. That's actually a pretty cool title.
These women were truly fascinating, and a lot of the titles that you'll hear, like the Jewish sorceress, that's not something that I really came up with. That is something that she was known as. And she got that name because of her victories. She had resisted the Muslim army, and they accused her of witchcraft and sorcery as her defeating them. So she became known as the Jewish sorceress. And she was unwilling to be subdued by her enemy. So she actually is believed to have committed her own demise because she would not be taken alive.
Okay, now I gotta read this book when it comes out, because that sounds like an amazing character, which then leads me to think of going back to my previous question is, why hasn't anyone done more research on these women? I mean, these stories are incredible. The situations they had to go through, the obstacles that were against them, and a bias in terms of the placement of these historical figures, in a sense of, in Europe, there's a lot more historical sources, as opposed to some would argue without doing proper research that there may not be a lot of written sources in somewhere in Egypt, Algeria, Sudan, Angola, Morocco, and so on. Do you think there is a bias to that in terms of like approaching these figures, because you're assuming there may not be a lot of research on them given the geography of where they are located?
I'm not sure it's so much as a bias as it was to the different capacity of maybe education or written skills.
Hmm.
As we know, Egypt was full of representation of everything. They
Yes.
documented everything. So, as far as different countries throughout the continent of Africa, Egypt is definitely one that stands alone as far as being on a whole other level of documentation. It's all over their walls.
Yes.
So all over their tombs. It was very important that they expressed in hieroglyphics who that person was, what this event was, what their culture was, religion, everything. Whereas these other countries may not have had either the same desire for that, they may not have had the skill, they may not have had the education. And it really could just be differing based on region and culture.
That's actually very true. That's a very, very fair thing to say. And I guess we also think of like the medieval age or even the classical age, we tend not to consider like the other places that, of course, in the Western world we have documentation, like the Roman Empire, Greece, Persia, the rise of Islam and the caliphates that came after them. We have documented sources on them, but we generally don't consider the other regions that existed during the classical and late antiquities era, like the continent of Africa has major stories. There are some that have like the kingdom of Ethiopia, the first Christian kingdom, who actually gave shelter to a lot of refugees during their time, and the history behind them. You also have the rise of the Mali kingdoms and all those nations along the west coast of Africa. There are so many stories um, on the continent of Africa that need to be shared. So, would you say, Katie, that this book, in your opinion, is a hopeful stepping stone to more discussion of the continent of Africa and the rich histories that exist within the many countries it has?
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote it. These women were truly fascinating. They were very flawed, but very powerful. And whether you take, you have the not so great things that they did versus their accomplishments, you make a human being and you make their contributions to world history. And something I wanted to add to your previous question, if you don't mind,
Okay.
I think one of the reasons why we don't have some of the information that we have is because other cultures may have torn it down. And the reason why I
Mm,
say that, going back to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, their names actually disappeared for about 1,000 years. They were unknown because the dynasties and the rulers after them physically tore down their buildings. They scratched their names out of hieroglyphics until hidden things were found that were not destroyed. So sometimes I think things have disappeared, perhaps because another party has been there to take it down. But sometimes if you dig a little bit deeper, they do emerge. And now we have information about them again.
definitely. And that is like 100% true. Like a lot of history of the past is always going to be replaced by someone new, someone stronger, and sometimes it will be difficult to find them. But as you said, if you keep digging, you're going to find it. And that's why I love doing these episodes. I love engaging with historians to learn more about, their interests and everything that they're working on, either it's like books, projects, everything, or talk that they're very fascinated in. And kind of another
It cut out. I didn't hear any of it.
oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry. As I was saying, in the discussion of women's history, trying to talk about the powerful impacts women have made throughout history from the classical age to the modern era. In your opinion, in your research, where do these women fit in the history?
I don't think I understand the question, to be honest with
Oh,
you.
okay. Maybe I probably said it wrong. I guess trying to say is that with all the achievements that you have found researched in on these women, is it fair to say that these women should be talked about more and belong in the historiography of women's history? I think it's a better question to say.
Yes, absolutely. These women had massive accomplishments that normally, historically speaking, would have been given to men in certain cultures. So I think that it's definitely worth celebrating. And not only is it important for just women's history, but the things that these women accomplished or did tie very well into world history. Like Njenga of Angola, she was very intricate in the ending of the Atlantic slave trade in Angola. And that was a huge movement of human flesh across an entire ocean to not just European countries, but all the way across to the east coast of North America. So their parts in history directly correlate to ours.
And that's why their stories need to be told, because they are part of the branch that is history. And kind of going to like the last few questions before we get to the end, Katie, and then more so about writing the book itself. So when you were writing the book and sort of like trying to gather all your sources and trying to write the story of these women, the overall narrative, did you have an audience in mind for this, or were you writing this book for yourself because you yourself are genuinely fascinated by this topic?
I definitely have an audience in mind. Obviously, I do take my thoughts into consideration because I do ask myself, what would I enjoy reading?
Mm-hmm.
And, versus what somebody else might. And if I don't enjoy reading it myself, I don't expect anybody else to. So the audience is definitely more of a scholarly nature. It's definitely not for children. The content in the book can be very sensitive. But it is definitely, if anyone loves history and is wanting to learn more about African history in particular, this is definitely the book for them.
Nice. And kind of still along those lines of, readers and like, your audience, I guess, and this is like a little author question, but I definitely think it is important for an historian author. So when you and your team were crafting this book, and I try to figure out how to market it, I don't know if you can talk about this, but I'll try wording away. I guess, how important is it for historian authors to like really understand their audience when it comes to, getting your book across? Like when you were talking with your team, did you want to go broad audience for like broad history enthusiasts, or were you initially trying to go for like specific sects in history that are really hardcore diehard fans of this subsection of history?
I would have to say probably a broader on the spectrum, but I really wanted to reach women history enthusiasts in particular, because this is something that I feel like we should be really proud of. These women that came before us, whether we share in their culture or not, it really shows how powerful women can be, that they can rule autonomously, that they can make really great decisions for their people on behalf of their people. So I'm really hoping that that women really do appreciate this book.
I hope so too. And again, when this comes out, I'm going to buy it. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to like give you my honest thoughts, because I am genuinely intrigued with this. And I'm looking at my desk right now, viewers. There's a space open for a book, so I'm going to reserve that space for your book when it comes out, Katie. And now, kind of like, I want to say the last question I want to ask you, Katie. So with this book, are there any other topics that you really want to explore? Any topics about women in history again, or maybe a different historical topic, a different era, or what is possibly in the works in the future that you can tell us about?
I do have an independent project that I've been working on. It is another book. It's more of a historical fiction. It is set in the American Revolution.
Ooh.
I won't give too many details, but that is definitely an ongoing project. And
Nice.
I do want to explore more into ancient cultures. I'm hoping for another book here in the future.
Awesome. Well, if you ever need another historian, another pair of eyes to help with the research, sign me up. I'll be more than happy to help out.
I very much appreciate your support, and I hope you enjoy the book.
Definitely. And I'm dead serious. I want to read that book so bad. And I just want to read the story of the Kush Queen and her story, because I guess sort of like tying it in, viewers, they are part of what I like to call like the forgotten history that encompasses like everything. And there are elements of history that are unfortunately forgotten. And that could be because of, you know, their own people may have forgotten about them, not recorded them, or a third party has taken over and erased them from history to make them appear that they never existed at all. Or there were just not a lot of scholarship written about them in the modern times. And I feel all history should have a chance to be explored, to have a discussion, because history needs to grow. It needs to be preserved. And as I always like to say, history, like writing a book or anything, has to always follow the 3 E's: to educate people, to entertain people, depending on the topic. If it's like a funny quirk in history or like a random event that had huge implications, and also to enlighten. That I think is the very most important thing for history and and this is a perfect way to end this amazing Historians Lounge episode. I'm going to give a huge thank you to our guest, historian Katie Clark, for coming on the show and for discussing her upcoming book with for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
You are welcome, Katie. Now, when can we expect your book coming out? Is it going to be sometime in the summer, in the fall, next year, or are you guys still finalizing the date?
It is projected to be released in April of 2025 in the UK, and then a US release afterward.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, you heard it here, folks. Be on the lookout for that. Be up to date and just keep your fingers crossed, and we'll just see what happens. So, Katie, thank you so much again for coming on the show. And where can people find and engage with you to learn more about the book and your other projects, and just be up to date with any other things you may be working on in the future? Either it's another magazine or your own independent project. Where can people find you?
You can always find me on LinkedIn. I also have my website, which is www.remembertheladies.com. And they can also find articles that are strictly dedicated to women's history on my Medium page.
I will link all those down below in the description of this video. And I will also advise you all, or I should say recommend that you all check out the very first episode me and Katie had during my Wandering Scribe podcast days, because that also has the links as well. And that was a very, very fun experience for the both of us. So again, Katie, thank you so much for coming on the show. I wish you the very best of luck with your future projects and the release of your book with Pen and Sword. I cannot wait for it to come out.
Thank you, Gabriel. I appreciate it.
And with that, listeners, this concludes this amazing Historians Lounge episode. Thank you all so very much. Make sure to check out Saturday's episode, which is coming soon. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below which women in Katie's book you are excited to learn more about. Until next time, have a good day.